Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Sorry that we ran out of a little bit of time there on Chapter 8, but we'll go ahead and get started with Chapter 12 here. Chapter 12 is covering the collective bargaining that takes place in public schools. So the first objective is examine how public sector bargaining has evolved over time. The chapter mentions that public bargaining came long after private sector had secured that right. So it mentions that private sector employees had already been negotiating with their employers regarding their salary, benefits, those things for many, many years before public employees had the opportunity to do that. The first state that was allowed to publicly bargain for their public employees was Wisconsin. The chapter did not state when that year was. But Wisconsin's the first state to do it. And currently there are still 5 states that do prohibit collective bargaining, do not allow it. Those states are Georgia, Missouri, North Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. So other than that, the rest of the states are allowed, the public employees are allowed to have that bargaining power. Laws governing bargaining vary in complexity and elements. So the things that can be bargained are very different depending upon state to state. The chapter talks about how, some union groups that have that bargaining power are considered essential government workers and are not allowed to go on strike if they are unable to make a bargaining agreement. A couple groups like that being railroad, post office services, those things can't shut down. So they are not allowed to go on strike. Teachers, however, are not considered essential government workers by most states. So as far as strikes, they are allowed in most states. Now, the chapter mentions that they're deplored because of the loss of learning that happens for students. So nobody is a fan of teachers going on strike and walking out of school districts, but it can happen. And it has happened in a few different states in the past. I know in 10 years, there's been strikes in Colorado. Denver teachers walked out. I know there were some strikes in Oklahoma. So it just depends on the state, but that does happen. Now, some states do prohibit striking. They say teachers cannot strike. They have laws against it. That doesn't stop striking from occurring, though. I did mention that some teachers still will walk out, even though it's rare. Some teachers will still walk out, even though it is against the law. And then it mentions that several states have adopted or are considering those laws that make striking illegal. But again, does that completely stop teachers from walking out of the job? Not always. So I think that was everything for one. So obviously Nebraska is a collective bargaining state. Each district usually has their own individual education association that's usually backed by the state's association. Have you guys had a lot of experience with the bargaining piece to your districts, or?
I have not been directly involved with the bargaining piece, but as the HR director, information that I have or I'm asked to gather becomes part of that, just as we talk about wages and incentive pay or student teacher incentives, any leaves that teachers want to take, that all becomes part of the negotiation process, but I myself don't sit in on negotiation. So yes and no there.
I've not been a part of it as administrator. Although I do fall under the master agreement with a lot of things that other than salary, but as far as being part of bargaining and those types of things, I've not been a part of that.
I was at my former school, I was the vice president of the education association. So I wasn't the specific lead negotiators, but I did meet with them a lot. And it's interesting to see, because I think some people just believe that with negotiations, you can just walk in and say, this is how much we want. That's what we're doing. And there's a lot more of a process there to it, as far as what you can ask for. You have to look at your array and what schools are in your array, how their salaries compare to your salaries, what their benefits look like. You can't just demand that you get a $1,500 raise when you're already at the highest level of your array and no other school. It's just not going to work. So there's a lot more that goes into bargaining than I think people are aware of if they've never been a part of that process. So.
Yeah,
Anything?
and that,
Oh,
oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go
Well,
ahead.
I was just gonna say that leads nicely into objective 2, but if you had something more to add to 1.
I do not. Todd, do you have
Okay.
anything?
No, I'm good.
All right. Objective 2.
So objective 2 is analyzing the scope of bargaining and how employee unions impacted bargaining. And this section really talks about the fact that there are certain state laws in every state that certain topics that boards and unions are required to discuss, as well as some that may not be subject to bargaining. When it talked about managerial rights, it talked about that they can't negotiate things like selection of new employees, budgeting, organizational structure. So there's certain things that are off limits, but then certain things that are required, like wages, terms and conditions of employment. So, those that are part of negotiations have to be very educated when they're going in to negotiate what they can and can't negotiate. And I found that in Norfolk, we just are starting a new cycle of school improvement and strategic goals. And one of our goals is on recruitment and retention. Well, the group that I have in on that involves a couple administrators, teachers, and some community members. And there's just a misunderstanding of how all of that works, because I hear things like, well, but this district has loan forgiveness stuff, and this district has this for insurance, and this district has this for salary, but trying to explain not one district has all of the things you're saying because of things like within their array, and there's only so much money in the pot. And so I think there needs to be some better education done with our entire staff. I know we have a great relationship with our group in Norfolk, our NCEA group, but I feel like our general population of teachers don't necessarily have a good understanding of what can be negotiated, what can't, and how far they can go on things. So I think that affects some of that as well. But the rest of the list really talks about other things that can and can't be addressed in negotiations, like teacher evaluation. Some put provisions in their contract. I think ours says in policy, will be evaluated while meeting state law. I don't know exactly what the wording is, but I think every district can have that a little bit different. Transfer and reassignment. Generally, our unions don't necessarily want teachers to be able to be moved out of their building and into different positions without agreement, but it can happen. Our superintendent can reassign as needed. The 3 years I've been HR director, it hasn't happened. She hasn't moved anyone, but we were close this year. We were short 2 business teachers, and we were close to having to move someone, not at the fault of any single staff member, but we had a position we had to get filled. So we got one, so we're okay, and no one had to be forced to be moved, but that is something that comes up. The selection and hiring piece I thought was interesting. We don't have anything in Norfolk that says that someone from the union needs to be part of the selection and hiring process. All our principals are expected to have staff as part of the interview team, but not necessarily those that are part of the union. So that probably can look different in different places. Other things on there: class size, extra duty. Our extra duty, obviously that's wages, salary, that does get discussed in negotiations and how they move across that. And we recently made some changes. We had some head coaches up higher than other head coaches, and there was some discrepancy. And so we had to kind of realign our extra duty schedule in, working with the union, just to make sure we were doing our best to please everyone, but still doing what we felt was right on there. And the reduction in force several years ago, that was big. That happened quite a few years ago and hasn't happened since for us. And I hope it doesn't. That's a lose-lose for everybody, really, when you have to go that route, and certainly a culture and morale crusher for something like that. Working conditions, things that might be in there might be some things might be some things that talk about discipline or safety potentially, but that's not something that really comes out in our negotiations in Norfolk. But I think it's things that could certainly be discussed if there were areas of concern. Leave is a huge one in negotiations. In Norfolk, I thought that was interesting. I was somewhere last week and one of the districts was talking about their leave, and they have unlimited paid sick days for their staff. And that blew my mind. We have 10 days a year, but you can bank them up to 75. I thought unlimited sick days, that sounds like a nightmare, but they said there's just only a few people that really abuse it because the rest of them are used to it, and that's just the way it is. So I thought that one was interesting. And then really when the chapter talked about safety and security, a lot of that was if they're in an area or a community that isn't unsafe, to ensure that the district is doing enough. I think safety and security is huge in every district right now, and hopefully on the forefront for everyone. Thoughts, Zach or Todd, on how some of these different categories fall into negotiations within your own district?
I always find it interesting, like you mentioned, the differences between negotiated agreements from district to district. So the former district I was at, they used all PTO. There was no sick, there was no personal, those types of things. It was PTO. You got PTO days. You could bank them as a sick bank if you needed to, but you had to use PTO before you could get to that. The current district I'm at does sick and personal. That's how they split it up. I didn't see in here anything about retirement benefits. One of the things that we have in our negotiated agreement here, which it was negotiated a long time ago, and I'm amazed at how well they were able to negotiate it in. They get $500 for every year of service if they retire by a certain date towards the back end of their career. If they do like an early retirement, $500 for every year of service to the district, as well as receiving single insurance until they hit Medicare age. So very well negotiated. One of the difficulties we're going to face as a district is we have a very veteran staff. I think our average year of tenure is 18 years in our district. And so we're going to start having a lot of teachers retire soon, and we're going to be running into paying single insurance and bonuses for, 5 to 7 staff members who are no longer working for us, which is going to damage the ability for our current teachers to negotiate for that extra salary. Because as Angie mentioned, there's only so much money in the pot. So when a lot of that money is going to people who have currently retired and no longer work for the district, that's going to make it difficult on the current employees. And I understand the idea of using that as a retention tool to keep people in your district as a thank you for their service to your district. But yeah, it does lead to some difficulties. So it doesn't mention that in there, but I know some schools use that as a piece of negotiation as their retirement benefit as they leave. So
a couple of things that we've done just based on as everybody knows, the cost of insurance continues to rise. 5 years ago, we did away with the in lieu of, where staff members could take in lieu of and got, I believe it's like, I don't know, some of money, $700 maybe, for not taking the insurance. As the prices of insurance went up, that now has gone away. Your grandfathered in, but nobody coming in the district can do that anymore. And then a few years ago, they negotiated for more personal days, and the conclusion or the way that was settled was they can take we all can use 2 sick days to buy a personal day. And so that kind of a good I guess that kind of ties into what objective 3 when we're talking about the different types of bargaining. That's kind of a win-win, and we'll get into that in our next objective.
all right, I'll go ahead and move to objective 3 here.
So the objective 3, the different forms or new forms of collective bargaining. And again, traditionally, collective bargaining has just been, it's kind of been adversarial. Like we go in, we want this. And then on the other side of the table is, well, we can't give you this. and then it's, it kind of turns into a competitive thing of who's going to get what they want and don't want. That type of collective bargaining was more based upon industry. So, and then education adopted that, but there's more constraints, obviously, for school boards than there are for the private business or the industry. When I was an HR director for B&R Stores, obviously our negotiations were quite different than what the negotiations would be for a school. And so then in recent years, there's been some new approaches. And one of them I just kind of talked about was the win-win. First of all, you have to have good faith to each other and trust each other. But in our situation, the win-win was, school board didn't want to give another personal day. Staff want another personal day. So the win-win was, okay, you can take those sick days and buy a personal day. And so I think that, that worked out to be something nice for everybody because, again, there's a win-win situation. But that had to deal with both parties trying to find a solution to that. And that's what they talked about with the win-win. Expedited bargaining. Hey, here's what we're going to go in. We're going to bargain on these 3 items, and here's the amount of time we're going to do this. And then you set a limit. This is how much time we're going to be bargaining on these things. And again, that's just so that you don't drag things out. The progressive bargaining, this obviously takes more time because you have more issues. You can use more issues, and then you can spend more time exploring those issues. Salary, for example, we talk a lot about the array. Well, how much time do we spend, not only just the array, but then also what do they have for sick days? What do they have for personal days? What do they have for insurance? What do they have that we don't have, or possibly, if we're looking into these things. So so that part of it again, the progressive part, being able to take more time and really explore. And then the principal negotiations, you just want to set your goals and meet the objectives. So you can look at all the different ones there. And again, I think anytime you start talking about negotiations, there's got to be that good faith. There's got to be a trust. I think where things can go south is if it's the board versus the teachers. It's got to be everybody coming together and trying to, we all have to see each other's sides on that. So the bargaining stages, rather than putting that chart in our slide, it's that figure 2.2. And if you look at that, it kind of goes through, obviously you have your initial stages where that could start as early as, early in the school year for the next year of here's what we're going to look at. So your negotiation teams get together, they talk about what they might be looking at. They use the word demands. I don't know. I think it's more of here's what we'd like for you to consider. Then you get into the middle stages where you're looking everything over and coming up with maybe countering back and forth. And then obviously the closing stage where you make your agreement and goes out to the teachers to look, and then the master agreement for the next year is signed. What can happen is, you can't agree. And then you go to what is impasse. And so then you have to resolve that impasse. So first thing is go to impasse. There's mediation where there's fact finding and arbitration. Again, salary seems to be one of the more easily referred to ones. So you look at the salary. Well, this is what this says. This is what this says. Do the fact finding on that. Then you've got the 2 types. You've got the compulsory arbitration where both parties state their case, and then decisions made. And then you've got that final offer arbitration where both sides submit their final offer. We want 25,000 on, 25,000 for a base. The board's telling us it's 27,000 for a base. The arbitrator may come in and say your base could be 26. Again, that could come back to hurt each side, because if it's too much of an extravagant demand, the arbitrator might just say, no, that can't even be done. And if it's not enough, the arbitrator may say, well, that you're not even being realistic here, so you have that. I think all of us who've been in education understand that the bargaining part and the negotiations part, they are all very, no matter how you do it, which way you look at it, it just comes down to everybody has to be responsible, mature, and be thinking of what's the end result. And that's providing an opportunity for teachers to be compensated well for whatever it may be. And also, the board has that other side of it, like Angie said on, Zach said on, of being good stewards with the money as well. So everybody has to see how we have to work together as a team to be successful in these things.
I would agree with you, Todd, that probably the most important thing is that everybody is respectful in those meetings. And you talk about win-win, being in good faith. I've seen where some districts lose that good faith with the board, and it does become teachers versus board and board versus teachers. And that always makes for a long negotiation process, makes for a difficult process, doesn't usually go as well as you would like it to. I believe, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the state of Nebraska does have dates in which the negotiated agreements have to be agreed upon, or that they have to be going into a mediation, and then even mediation has to be done by a certain point as well. I don't know the dates off the top of my head, but I know the state of Nebraska, I think, has dates that have to be met for those different things. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, I don't know those dates either.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that because you don't want your arbitration needs to be completed before your school year begins, because you want to make sure that teachers know what the negotiated agreement's going to be going into the school year. So I think, or it might be shortly thereafter, but I think you can also push negotiations off for a year if things aren't going, if you can't come to an agreement. I think there's an ability to move that to the next year, and then it just operates off the former one. And then you end up having to back pay those things. But there's a lot of nuances to it that I don't think the chapter necessarily covers there, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been a part of where it didn't get agreed upon until I think September or October, I can't remember. And then you're absolutely right. Then you just, whatever the difference in that salary or whatever was made up in your next checks.
Yeah. Anything else on objective 3 here?
No.
All right. So objective 4 was discuss the impact that collective bargaining has had on schools. And the chapter mentions that there's no question collective bargaining has had a major impact on public schools. But the question is, has the impact been positive, negative, or a neutral effect? And so there's 3 questions that the chapter says are often asked to try and decide whether collective bargaining has been a positive or a negative. Those 3 questions include: what has it been the effect on teacher salaries? How much and in what ways does collective bargaining affect the quality of instruction in schools? And then what effect has it had on principals' power? So breaking down those questions, the first one, teacher salary. Teacher salaries in districts where they have collective bargaining, teacher salaries are anywhere from 5 to 12% greater than those who do not have collective bargaining. I don't feel like that's a shocking statistic, that when they get a chance to bargain for their salary, that they're going to have a higher salary than districts that don't. Teachers in districts with bargaining also receive greater advantage in size and number of fringe benefits paid to them. And teachers in districts with bargaining also have received advantages in non-monetary benefits, such as more planning time, fewer students. I know, like in our negotiated agreement, it states that our teachers will have 6 class periods of instruction, a plan, and a homeroom. So it does lay out that they only teach for a certain amount of it, instructional periods. So I guess it's not shocking to me that teachers' salaries and benefits are better if they're in a district where they can bargain. Anything jumping out at you guys here? Or
No.
The next piece was the student learning. And based on the chapter's it said research has suggested that collective bargaining effect on student learning is for the most part a positive. It doesn't show a negative correlation there. They said that higher standardized test scores in districts that collectively bargain, you see higher SAT and ACT scores, as well as state achievement tests as well. It does mention that the main issue that collective bargaining has against, or the negative piece to student learning, is when teachers go on strike. So when an agreement can't be made by the district or by the negotiating team, it leads to strikes or stoppage of work, which then leads to student lack of learning, learning loss, lost instructional time. It does mention that the longer the strike, the more negative the impact on student learning, which also makes sense because the longer you're not having class, the more learning is lost from the students. So, and then the last thing that it mentions is the work of principals. And it said that some people will make the argument that collective bargaining has imposed limits on principals' abilities to run their school. Basically, what it talks about is principals have made comments that it's difficult to terminate incompetent teachers because they are protected so much by the negotiated agreement. And unions will argue back that no, it's just weak-kneed administrators who don't want to go after teachers and do the right appropriate steps to remove teachers who are incompetent. But it does talk about how, negotiated agreements protect teachers. And so it does make it a little bit more difficult for a principal to terminate someone who is protected by that agreement. Not impossible, right? There's just a lot more steps that take place. So it does require some more work there. Principals need to be able to abide by the master contract and be flexible. So it talks about, if you are somebody who works under a freewheeling style of management, it's not going to work very well. You have to follow the negotiated agreement. So that's an important piece there. And then in the end, it basically comes to the agreement that all in all, administering a school that either operates with a negotiated agreement or without one is very similar. So as far as the impact on principals' work, the chapter says that it doesn't really affect a principal's work all that much in a district, regardless of whether they bargain or not. So anything to add on that objective, guys? That's pretty much it on that. So again, collective bargaining, I guess, after you go through the chapter and it talks about that teacher salaries are better. If you go back to the 3 questions, it does say that teacher salaries are better. How does it affect the quality of schools? It does mention that it is a positive towards the instruction. And then what effect has it had on principals? Basically said that was a neutral one. So out of the 3 questions, if 2 of them are positives, then based on what this chapter is putting out information, it looks like bargaining in schools is a more positive impact than a negative one. So, all right. Anything else on chapter 12 before we finish?
Oh,
I don't have anything.
All right.